Welcome back to the second hour of our program. On the line with us is our buddy Phil Ittner. He's reporting live from Kyiv, Ukraine, a veteran war correspondent, American war correspondent in Kyiv. Phil, by the way, you can follow him on Twitter at Philip Ittner, I-T-T-N-E-R, Philip with one L. And he's also got a YouTube video blog over at Philip Ittner on YouTube. So, Phil, welcome back to the program. How are you? I understand you've been traveling around Ukraine. In fact, I think you were, Sean told me you were over in the Donbass region in the last week or so?
I was. Over the weekend, about 4 days I spent out in the Donbass, pretty much just off the front lines near Bakhmut and Soledar. I was privileged enough to spend a little bit of time with a Ukrainian rocket artillery brigade, and they were showing us, myself and a colleague, some of the NATO equipment that they had received. I spent a day, for example, out with a unit that had an M270 multiple launch rocket system, which is the predecessor to the HIMARS. We didn't get a fire mission, so we didn't see them actually shooting the thing, but we got to talk to them. We got to talk to them about their supplies, how they were working with the weapon system the United States provided to them, how they're living, that sort of thing, how they're adjusting to what is a minor breakthrough by Russian troops and Wagner mercenaries, that Russian mercenary group. It was very enlightening, and it was enlightening not only to spend time with the troops, it was also enlightening to just see the lay of the land, to be in the proximity of the firing line, and to get a further understanding what it is to be out on the tip of the spear.
Any specifics of that you'd like to share with our audience?
Absolutely. There's a whole bunch, so I'm going to have to limit it because there's too much to talk about in the time that we have. But one of the things that really struck me was the lay of the land, to get a good conception of the terrain itself. And out in Donbass, certainly in that part of the Donbass, what it is, Tom, is it's basically long sloping elevations that are not sharp inclines. They're sloping up to a high point, and then they drop down, and the same thing happens, like waves and waves.
Sort of like the Appalachians?
Sure, like the approach to the Appalachians. I've heard that comparison before as well. Mm-hmm. But what that means to me is that when they ask for NATO made battle tanks, or they're asking for Bradley armored fighting vehicles, it's because they are anticipating that kind of terrain that they're going to be fighting over, for a multitude of reasons, but that's one of them. And it's like there's the famous battle in the first Persian Gulf War called 73 Easting, where about 12 Abrams tanks, NATO style Abrams tanks, modern NATO tanks, about 12 of them held off an entire division of Iraqi Soviet-style tanks that would be similar to almost exactly a apple-to-apple comparison of the terrain and the situation that we're looking at in the Donbass. So if they can get a few, like the Challenger tanks that are coming from the Brits, and they hold those ridge lines, they control, because Tom, you have to understand, when you're on that long sloping, as you say, like the approach to the Appalachians, you can see everything for miles.
Right.
If you're on the top of those ridge lines, and they're an open terrain basically, because there are sparse little forests, but mostly it's open field.
It's farmland.
They could control miles and miles of territory with very few modern NATO tanks. So it really was very helpful for me to get an idea of what it's like out there and why it is that a small amount of tanks could have a very significant effect on the battlefield. Fascinating.
Now, the Dmitry Medvedev, who has been taking turns with Putin back when the Constitution, before Putin rewrote the Constitution, their Constitution term limited the presidency. He has now come out and said that if Russia loses the Ukraine, or the Ukraine war, that that will provoke a nuclear war with the West. It sounds to me like that's desperation. I'm curious your thoughts as a war correspondent and an observer of these kind of political things for years. And how is it being received in Ukraine?
Well, and I also lived in Russia, so I have a certain insight into the Russian mentality as well. How is it being received in Ukraine? It's being received in much of the way that a lot of people actually in the West are also seeing it, in that if you're falling back on your nuclear trump card, then you definitely recognize that you are losing on the battlefield.
Right, you've lost.
Also, in addition, yeah, you can't win conventionally, so you have to come out and bring out your biggest threat. But the problem that I am hearing in circles around Europe, certainly here in Ukraine, and I hear it also in certain circles in America, the problem with that for us is if we acquiesce to it, then we're always going to be beholden to Russian threats, because they can always ultimately just say, we have nukes.
Right, so and up next is Latvia, and then Lithuania, and then Estonia.
And so then are we always going to be beholden to a country because it has nuclear weapons? And not only is that a danger for international relations when it comes to Russia and an aggressor state like Russia, but what kind of message does that send to other nations that are afraid that maybe other powerful countries, including the United States, might want to influence their country, and the only thing that seems to stop that is the threat of a nuclear strike. That will not go well for trying to stop nuclear proliferation. Right. So we're kind of caught in a hard part here, where if we give into that threat, then it only is going to embolden not only Russia as an aggressor state, but other nation states to pursue that same kind of ability. And then comes the question is, are they bluffing? And in many ways, I think a lot of people have recognized that they are bluffing. You don't want to play too fast and loose with a nuclear weapon, because, of course, that's an awful exchange. But, would they really do it? Because once you sound that alarm bell, once you have crossed that barrier, there's no going back. Right. So it's their last defense. And many here, Ukrainian forces are saying, they're saying that because they know we're going to win, especially with the amount of weaponry that is being sent here and the will of the Ukrainian armed forces and the entire Ukrainian nation, as a matter of fact, supporting those armed forces. The Russians are going to lose. The question is, do they pull out that awful weapon of war, not even a weapon of war, really, just a weapon of mass destruction, in response? And lots of Ukrainians are saying, well, we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't, proverbially. And, you can't live under the fear of constant nuclear strikes, because that just gives the Russians the ability to do whatever they want.
Right. Now, there's also reports, we're talking with Phil Ittner, by the way, the veteran war correspondent, American war correspondent, who's brought live right now in Kyiv, Ukraine, just got back from the Donbass region. You can find his reporting also on his own video blog over on YouTube, PHILIPITTNER. Phil, there's discussion about basically, I believe it was the day before yesterday, after that terrible helicopter crash, that President Zelensky came out and said words to the effect of, we are going to try to reclaim the Crimean Peninsula. And we're hearing here in the United States that the Biden administration might be just fine with that, and which would really mean that the Russians put their foot in it, right? What are your thoughts on that, and how is that being characterized in Ukraine?
Well, by and large, Ukrainians would they intend to seize back Crimea. That's their intention. Now, Tom, my impression of that, and this is my analysis, this is not me providing you with news, this is me providing you with my personal analysis. Crimea is going to be a very difficult situation, because the Russians very much do see it as their territory. And in the Russian constitution, or in their defense doctrine, their use of nuclear weapons is justified if the motherland, and they now perceive Crimea as their motherland, as part of the motherland, is invaded. Crimea goes back centuries for the Russians. It's kind of been handed back and forth between Ukraine and Russia, of course, for many, many years, centuries indeed. Ukraine was part of imperial and then subsequently Soviet Russia. Right. So the identity, the hold that Crimea has for the Russians is a very important one.
Well, it's not just the ancient thing too, Phil. One of my kids
this
studied.
is strategic.
Yeah, one of my kids went to college in Simferopol in Crimea, studied Russian there, and she told us the story that we heard was that this is like Florida. This is where the Russians go to retire. It's got a nice climate. It's where their big naval bases are. It's where all the military brass, they all retire in Crimea, and there's a huge Russian population there. That's got to complicate the situation.
Indeed, it does. And that's why I'm trepidatious about saying whether or not we should support them seizing back Crimea. I know a lot of my Ukrainian friends right now are probably angry at me for having said that. But the problem is that you do have a pro-Russian population, a very large pro-Russian population in Crimea. You also have the base for the Black Sea Fleet, which is a full quarter of Russia's naval power. And it's the only naval port that stays open year-round because it's a warm water port, which they are seriously lacking in Russia. So for them to lose Crimea and Sevastopol would be a massive, massive defeat for them. I mean, not just in this war, but this is a place that Catherine the Great conquered back in the 18th century. That's how they achieved, that's how they took dominion of Crimea. It's tricky. It's really tricky. And then, of course, there's the possibility that ultimately you're looking at a Ukraine that is occupying Crimea. How much of a resistance will there be to Ukraine reclaiming Crimea? Right. There's the Tatar population, the Muslim population on the peninsula there. Crimea is not as straightforward as the rest of this conflict. And it's going to be tricky. And ultimately, I think will have to be negotiated. I don't know if there will be a military conflict, but don't hold me to that.
Well, that might be the card that Zelensky's got in his back pocket, is that he can. Well, I don't know. I don't want to speculate.
Yeah, no. War is a fickle mistress, and she will do what she will do. But
yeah,
I'm concerned about Crimea. I don't necessarily think that reseizing Crimea is the right way to go, but it also might indeed be the right way to go.
I get it.
But ultimately,
Phil,
Ukraine has to win this war.
Phil, it's great talking with you. Thanks so much. Stay safe, my friend.